Can a person fully recover from schizophrenia? The answer is yes and no. In schizophrenia, there's something called the rule of thirds, where the top third of people do very well. They may take medication, they may not take medication. They're able to hold down a job, maybe get married, maybe have a family. In the middle third, they have a little bit more difficulty. They may take meds, they may need to go back to the hospital every so often to adjust their meds. Things may not go smoothly at their job. And then there's the bottom third of people who have schizophrenia who don't function well at all. They're probably on medication, but they just can't cope day to day. They may be in a hospital in long-term settings. They may need to live in a group home if they're doing a little bit better than those in the hospital. So yes, people can recover, but not everyone. I was medicated and diagnosed with schizophrenia in February of 2008. I remember at the time I was 30 years old. After a couple months into taking medication on a daily basis, my delusions started to clear up. I started thinking more clearly, and I realized certain hallucinations were hallucinations. They weren't real. I remember thinking at the time, this is the clearest my mind has been in 10 years since I was 20 years old. I could pinpoint an exact time when I was in college, when I was doing well, compared to the very next semester where I started to get symptoms and my grades just fell off the map. The first thing I did after getting diagnosed with schizophrenia was try to read more about it. This was difficult. I went to the library and literally found nothing on schizophrenia, nothing in the library at all that I could read about the history of schizophrenia, about what it is, what are delusions, what are hallucinations. I went to the bookstore and I couldn't find anything. The only thing I could find was a copy of the book Girl Interrupted. I read it, but it was a good story and everything, but it took place in the 1960s in a mental institution, and things were so much different back then compared to what they're like today. The next thing I did was I joined a support group. I wanted to talk about my illness. I wanted to just, talk it out to understand what was happening with me from other people's perspective, from my own perspective. I remember thinking at the time, and this had gone on for a couple of years, I really wanted to meet someone else who had schizophrenia. I had never met anyone who had schizophrenia. Eventually down the road I did meet people who were schizophrenic, but by then I had kind of figured things out for myself. The last thing I did after being medicated and diagnosed with schizophrenia was go back to school. I was poor. I lived and worked in a hotel. I made like $300 a week, and my rent was about $140 a week. And then so the rest went to car insurance, gasoline, food, groceries, and whatever I had left went to beer and cigarettes, neither of which I use today. So I returned to school. I wanted to study accounting. I studied accounting. Eventually realized that I didn't have the aptitude for it. I couldn't do it, and eventually got into substance abuse counseling, which I was reluctant to do. I thought it would be a good fit, but I was reluctant to do because they don't get paid very much. In the summer of 2009, about a year and a half after I was diagnosed, I had a craving for drugs. I hadn't done drugs since April of 2005, so this is over 4 years later. I had a really strong craving, so I got up out of bed, I hopped on the computer, and I said, let me just search for volunteer jobs. I ended up applying to, interviewing, and taking a job as a volunteer in a substance abuse clinic. And at that point I was still studying accounting, but that kind of changed things for me, and I really started to give substance abuse counseling more thought, which was what I eventually gotten into. While I was at that volunteer job, I remember thinking, I'm working, I'm going to school, I'm getting ahead, I'm fully recovered. That's it. There's nothing more to do. I'm fully recovered. I can do this. But a couple of years later, that wasn't so much the case. In 2011, I landed my first paying job in 3 years. It was a night auditor at a hotel, another hotel job, working third shift weekends. I was thankful that they gave me another shot at work because I had been unemployed. And I stayed there for a couple of years. But complaints about residual symptoms like intrusive thoughts and also panic attacks sort of followed that job until my panic attacks were so bad that I didn't think I'd ever work full-time ever again. 2 years later, in 2013, I landed my first professional job. It was another third shift job, but it was in peer recovery. So it was my first position that I was like qualified for that I took, rather than something that in a hotel where they just hire anybody. So I was working third shift, and about 6 months later, my boss asked me if I wanted to start a substance abuse group. At that time, I had just finished school the previous year, and I said, sure, absolutely, I would love to do a substance abuse group. So I found a supervisor, talked it out with him, set up the group, and eventually started doing the group. And it wasn't until about a year later that I told my boss and my supervisor I was never trained in group therapy. What I did was I went back to school, and I didn't go back to school, but I went and talked to one of my professors, and he recommended I read a couple books. I read whatever I could find on group therapy and just started doing it, and things eventually worked out for themselves. A couple years later, in 2015, I created a mental health group in another department, and I felt like I had come full circle professionally. I had experience with substance abuse, and I had experience with mental illness, and I was able to put those two to work and do groups on both of them. At that point, I felt like I could return to full-time work. My panic attacks were long gone by then. I had taken medication that eventually cured my panic attacks. I felt like I could have gone to work full-time, but the pay wasn't good. The pay was terrible. So looking forward in 2017, this year, I expect to take my Certified Addictions Counselor exam and hopefully pass it. And at that point, when I have the credentials, I'm going to return to full-time work, probably within the same company I work for now. I still have issues. My biggest issue right now is actually chronic fatigue syndrome, which I've had since the summer of 2012. I need to take naps. I just can't stay awake sometimes. I fall asleep at work a lot. I'm not supposed to do that, but I do. It's a medical problem, but it's a barrier to me working full time. That's my biggest issue. Sometimes I occasionally hear voices, intrusive thoughts, things like that. But I've always heard that. I'll hear it in the future. That's probably never going to go away. But I've learned to deal with it. I want to go back to where I left off. In my mid-20s, I was addicted to drugs, and I was having mental illness symptoms. But at the time, I was working as an office manager of a hotel, and I owned my own condo. I want to return to that life. I want to start again. I want to go back to where I left off and continue. And I think at that point, once that happens, being fully recovered is something that I will be able to say that I have done. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Ryan, and thanks for watching.